I'd like to welcome you all to Module 3 of the Natural Systems Agriculture course that some of you are taking for credit and others are taking as a certificate course. So my name is Martin Entz. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba and the Jarislowsky Chair in Natural Systems Agriculture for Climate Solutions. And it's my pleasure to welcome you again to this module. So I am going to share my screen and we will get going. So in Module 3, we're going to talk a little bit more about the soil system and especially some of the cycles in the soil system. And so let's get started right now. Many of you have seen the introductory slide already in the previous modules, and I'm coming to you here from this area south of Lake Winnipeg, which is Manitoba, and it's on Treaty 1 lands. So we have talked about this sort of hierarchy before. We're talking about soil, and then we're going to start talking about plants and animals and humans and the ecosphere. And what I've done in this slide is shown a number of cycles that are that apply to the soil plant system. I want to talk about them, and I always want us to have a view to the solar energy, which fuels the agricultural system, and also the hydrological cycle. So here are a number of cycles that are involved in the soil plant atmosphere interface. We've got the phosphorus cycle, the sulfur cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle. And uh, I think you can go to any textbook or any internet site and you can understand these cycles in some detail. But one of the questions that I like to ask myself is, are these cycles all operating at the same speed? Are some faster than others? And so I'm going to pose that question to you. Which do you think are the fast cycles, are the slowest cycle? Um, when we look at the ones that are listed here, we often think of the phosphorus cycle as being quite slow relative to something like photosynthesis, which involves the sun, and the carbon cycle, which is very fast. As soon as that sun comes up over the horizon and there's chloroplasts in the plant material, we get photosynthesis. So something to think about. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of, just to warm up the lesson, I want to talk about some of these cycles, sometimes just the solar energy, sometimes just the water. And in this example, I want to remind us of this diagram that we saw in an earlier lecture where I was describing the solar energy capture by a range of crops that we grow here in Manitoba. So we've got um, crops that start to photosynthesize very early in the season when there's probably still frost in the soil, and crops that will photosynthesize all the way into the middle of October. So, up to 5 months of growth potential. Now, when we link that solar energy capture to the water cycle, we can ask ourselves the question, which crops use water most efficiently to capture that solar energy? And for that, we can go to the left-hand data, which is work that I did many years ago for my PhD, where I looked at the water use efficiency of winter wheat, which is the North Star variety here, and spring wheat, which is the Katepwa variety. And here we're looking at the water use efficiency, the grain production per hectare per millimeter of evapotranspiration. And what's interesting is the winter wheat is almost always significantly more efficient at translating uh, uh, water into grain yield. And the same for dry matter production of the winter wheat, of the wheat, I should say. And that's because the winter wheat is growing early in the season, much like the fall rye here. So it is able to photosynthesize more efficiently. The water can be used, the temperatures are lower, so the water can be used to produce biomass, plant growth, and the plant doesn't need as much water to cool itself. So that's an example of managing the hydrological and the carbon cycle for more productivity. So if we can do that, um, it's really employing natural systems, but allowing our crops to go through their growth cycles when things are cooler. Another example that I want to share just focuses on solar radiation, and the crop here is canola. Canola is one of Canada's, if not the most important crop every year, but economically right up there. And it is very susceptible to high temperatures during flowering. And this is a very interesting analysis that these Canadian scientists did is they um, produced this map, and on the x-axis here is the number of days where the temperature is above 29.5 degrees Celsius. And what they're showing in these values here in these isobars is the economic optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate for those uh, temperature situations. And we can see that as the heat stress on the canola goes up, the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that it would pay to put on goes down. And that's because the yield potential is going down. So we know that canola is a very heat sensitive crop. It's probably our most heat sensitive crop. And so anything that can be done to cool the growing environment for this crop is going to allow us to maintain yield potential. So you can ask yourself, what would those production practices be? Would it be intercropping? Would it be agroforestry with canola? What would it be? Another story that it involves water, and that is surface soil water loss by evaporation. And one of the benefits of conservation agriculture is it asks us to leave a residue on the surface. Some people call it armor on the soil, some people just call it crop residue. And what it does is it reduces the amount of water that's lost by evaporation. So more of that water gets pushed through the plant, which is going to allow it to grow. So evapotranspiration is the combination of E and T, evaporation plus transpiration. So what can happen with a surface residue is we increase the fraction of transpiration per unit of evapotranspiration. And about 20 years ago, scientists in Saskatchewan showed us that not only does that mulch reduce water loss by evaporation, it allows the biological nitrogen fixation process in peas and lentils to actually improve because legumes like a cooler soil environment. And this has also been documented in many other parts of the world. Another example of how the water cycle can be adjusted is through harvest management. This is a machine, well, it's a combine harvester, but at the front end, this is a stripper header. And this machine will only take the seed heads or the pods off the plant, and it will leave the straw very, very tall. And that tall straw reduces the movement of air across that field, which reduces the evaporative water loss even further. If you're wondering, here I gave this talk to a group of Ukrainians and tried to do it in their language. In our part of the world here in Canada, we get about a third of our precipitation as snow. And so trapping that snow, whether it's with cover crops or with no-till conservation agriculture, it is a very effective way to get a little bit more of that snow water into the system. So what I've done till now is I've given you just a couple of examples, a few examples of how the carbon cycle and the hydrological cycle interact, um, and how we can think about manipulating the natural processes of carbon and hydrological cycling to improve crop productivity. Now, the other tool that we have is human intervention by adding diversity to the farming system. And this example deals with water. It comes from Iowa from a long-term study where they compared a corn soybean rotation with a rotation that had corn, soybeans, and then 1 year of oats, and then 1 year of alfalfa. And they're measuring the rooting depth of the maize or of the corn. And over 3 years, you can see the blue line shows that the corn grew deeper in the extended rotation with the four crops. So another way that we can improve water capture for crop production is to diversify the crop rotation. And that diversity allows for healthier root growth. In China, water is managed, especially in northwest China, which is the Gansu province here. Water is managed by the use of plastic. And so here is an intercrop of maize grown under plastic and chickpea, and the chickpea is not grown under plastic, um, as a way of providing an optimum environment for each crop. Chickpea likes drier conditions to get it to become reproductive, and maize needs more water. And I believe this might be my final example of water. This comes right here from Manitoba, where some very innovative farmers on the eastern edge of the prairies, in a place where excess water is actually can be a chronic problem. They took this 300-acre field and created surface drains and collected the water at the edge of the field. And um, this is the collection sump that you just saw. And then they pump that water into this storage pond, and that water can be used either for future irrigation or it can be released for another purpose. This is quite unique, and it is a response to when farmers have too much water. And the reason they're not using tile drainage here is the cost, and these vertisolic soils do not lend themselves very well to tile drainage. Here's another picture of the large holding reservoir. These farmers have three of these systems in various parts of their farm. So they're managing the water through gravity with a little bit of pumping, and uh, I think there are some nature-based elements to their management system. So let's pause now and spend a moment just thinking about questions you have about water use efficiency, ideas that you might have. Please pause the video and put them into our pot of soil. Okay, so another really important cycle that I want to spend much of the rest of the lecture on is the nitrogen cycle. As we talked about in the first class, when we think about ecology, we know that the stability and sustainability of managed systems can be maintained or increased by replacing external energy subsidies with mutually beneficial functions found in nature. And so that means emphasizing biological nitrogen fixation and de-emphasizing the role of fossil fuels in nutrient management. So let's address some of the questions that often come up around nitrogen. And one of the questions, especially given the massive increase in the amount of conservation agriculture in this part of the world, is farmers are saying, do no-till soils increase nitrogen use efficiency? And Dr. David Franzen from the North Dakota State University, which is located just south of us here, um, looked at different paired fields across the state of North Dakota and concluded that on average, uh, there was greater nitrogen fixation in conservation agriculture or no-till soils than soils where tillage was used. And just remind us that um, there was there's also greater biological nitrogen fixation in these no-till fields. And this is exactly the same paper that I showed you earlier when I talked about the mulch cover. So this is exciting. No-till soils have the potential to increase nitrogen use efficiency because they improve soil biology. But the main player in using um, uh, biological natural approaches to enrich the soil with nitrogen is through legumes. Now, there are so many legume species. There's so many species in that family that there's a legume for everybody in just about every production situation in the world. Here's four different examples that apply to our part of the world. In cool, dry conditions, field peas are an excellent pick. In wet conditions, we've got faba bean, which can handle flooding. In hot conditions, soybeans grow well. We've also grown lab in Canada, and under hot, dry conditions, uh, Lathyrus sativus, or what we call chickling vetch, is well adapted. So there's many different species to choose from. Do legumes increase nitrogen use efficiency in agriculture? Well, the question really here is do we get greater nitrogen use efficiency if a higher proportion of the nitrogen that we supply to our crops comes from biological nitrogen fixation? And the answer is yes. As we increase the percentage of synthetic fertilizers as the total nitrogen inputs, that efficiency goes down. So to increase the role of legumes to supply nitrogen, we can grow more grain legumes, we can add perennial legumes, and we can grow legume cover crops. This is from our Glenlee long-term rotation, and I just wanted to illustrate how much less fossil fuel energy we use when we have a rotation that includes, in this case, a 2-year perennial alfalfa crop. These diagrams here are measuring the energy use it requires to grow wheat, either in this annual grain rotation or in this rotation with 2 years of alfalfa. And we can see that this system uses 2,000 fewer megajoules of energy per hectare. And that's mostly because this system requires less nitrogen fertilizer. So I'm showing you this because it's another way of looking at the role of legumes in the energy budget of cropping systems. And by the way, this analysis was a very comprehensive one. So when we look at tillage, this includes the energy that it takes to make the equipment that does the tillage. So it's very comprehensive. I'll let you study this on your own if you'd like, but here we're looking at, again, the different sources of legume nitrogen. We can have annual green manures or legume cover crops. This is how much nitrogen they contribute. The nitrogen contribution is really a function of how much biomass you produce. Perennial alfalfa will produce this much, and then grain legumes. What we notice in our part of the world is that peas, lentils, and faba beans really supply much more nitrogen than chickpea, dry bean, or soybean to following crops. That's not true everywhere, and that may be because we have cooler soils and also that our history of soybean production is not as extensive as some other parts of the world. And if we go out to our farms to see how these legumes in rotation affect the crop, what we're looking at here is wheat after flax, which is an oilseed crop. It does not fix nitrogen. We can see that characteristic yellowing in the lower part of the canopy. And where we grew wheat after a pea grain crop, we can see a much greener understory. And clearly, some of that nitrogen from the pea straw is being mineralized and being made available to those crops. What are some other ways of increasing the production of nitrogen from legumes? Well, one of them is intercropping, growing the legume together with something like maize or wheat. And this is a study here from China, and these are some images from Zimbabwe, where legumes have been intercropped with maize. And what we do know, well, what we're seeing here in this extreme drought situation is the lab will produce some food, but the maize has failed. So intercropping has other benefits. But in terms of the amount of nitrogen that legumes can can capture from the atmosphere, which is 78% nitrogen, um, growing them together with a non-legume can actually make them work harder. Farmers in Canada have been asking, what about seeding a very innocuous, small seeded crop like alfalfa together with something like maize and just leaving it there for that one growing season? And some studies, this one from Minnesota, is showing that that system will fix 64 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare and transfer that a lot of that to the corn during the growing season. And that's depicted here in this paper. So just another example of how legumes can be used. And then a very recent paper has asked the question, what percentage of the intercrop should be legume to optimize the total production and the total amount of nitrogen derived from the legume? And this paper was just published in the very good Plant and Soil Journal. And I don't have time to go into detail, but the answer is about 35%. 35% of the plant material as legume resulted in the optimum situation in this case. So important is intercropping as a way of providing nutritional security, um, uh, enhancing mutualistic properties that a lot of communities, a lot of agronomists are working with farmers to try and improve adoption of intercropping. And this here shows some of the enabling factors that people are using when they're conducting workshops with farm organizations, and they're trying to stress where enabling factors can be improved and also stressing the benefits of the intercrop. So education and knowledge gathering is really important. So we'll stop here and get you to plant your questions and ideas. And we're really focused in this little section of the module on intercropping, showing nitrogen benefits. We have heard that legumes seem to work harder to fix nitrogen when they're intercropped. And one thing I didn't emphasize is that some crops are maybe a little bit better at intercrop partners than others. Maize seems to be a very good crop to intercrop with legumes. Recently, there's been a lot of interest in late season cover crops, and the Canadian government has actually supported this through various programs. What are late season cover crops? Well, this really fascinating illustration from Germany in the 1930s shows that the grain has been cut and stooped and ready for threshing, and the area from where the grain has arisen the farmers are planting a crop. So this is a second crop that season, but here the season is so short, we can't really get a second grain crop. So we're growing that crop simply for its nitrogen or for other purposes. This is an illustration of a legume used to increase nitrogen during that late season period. And I should also add that when we have these late season cover crops, they will utilize water. That reduces the water-filled pore space, which reduces the potential for nitrous oxide emissions from those soils. So that's another benefit. There are many different species to choose from. There's many different niches, and there's all kinds of good websites to find out what are the attributes of different cover crops. I'm not going to go through this information here in detail, but I will say that when we grow winter wheat, which remember is a little bit more water use efficient than spring wheat, it's harvested a little bit earlier. Um, we can get what we call fertilizer replacement values, or that's the amount of nitrogen that we would have to add with fertilizer to get the same yield the following year after the cover crop. Um, those numbers are not insignificant, from 20 to 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So these late season cover crops, where they're adapted, can be quite powerful tools for adding nitrogen. Okay, so that's a lot about getting the nitrogen into the system. I now want to talk about getting that nitrogen back out so we can grow crops, because that's really what we're trying to do here. So terminating these legumes starts the process of mineralization. So here we have a green legume plant with its nodules and its high protein leaves, and we want to kill it somehow and get it to decompose, release those nutrients so the crop can take it up. That decomposition process puts the nitrogen in the soil, and then it is mineralized uh, using biological activity and made available to crops. So if we incorporate our cover crop and start that mineralization process, this is the rate of mineralization of nitrogen. We also want to be careful to make sure that we have a crop there that's going to utilize it so that we don't lose that valuable nitrogen. So the synchrony here is important to pay attention to. Now, there are ways that we can manage the mineralization process. And I've got a statement here. Organic farming forces agronomists and farmers to understand nitrogen mineralization and how to manage it. And that's because in organic farming, this is pretty well our only source of nitrogen. So if we think about speeding up that mineralization, the number one way to do that is to have live ruminants graze the legume material, and they'll process it, and a few hours later it'll come out of the back of the animal. It'll be like liquid fertilizer. The second quickest thing is to till the soil, and then we can look at three systems that slow down the mineralization: the flail mower, cutting it and leaving it on the surface, blade rolling it, and then cultivating it with a wide blade, and then the blade roller results in the slowest release of the nitrogen. So here we have a flail mower, and you can see on the bottom it has chopped up the residue. And here we have the crimper roller, which lays the material on the surface but does not chop it up. This is the slowest nitrogen release. And by the way, we have done this work with smallholder farmers in the tropics. And indeed, the crimper roller was really invented in Brazil by smallholder farmers. So if we find ourselves in a situation where we have a lot of legume material and we've put it into the soil system, and we maybe have a lot of precipitation and warm conditions, uh, even with the best management, there's a risk that we could lose some of that nitrogen. And that's where catch crops come in. Catch crops like tillage radish here, they are grown specifically to stop nitrogen losses. They take up the nitrogen and hold it in their bodies until, in our case, until the springtime when they virtually just melt and release the nitrogen to that crop. So here's an image of some work that we did in Canada at the Carmen Research Station. We've got a PO'd green manure that was growing here. It was grazed by sheep. And then we planted these different catch crops, barley, tillage radish, um, and in early August after the green manure termination. This picture was taken in October of the same year. And what we observed is that both of these crops were very efficient at taking up the nitrogen and keeping the nitrogen from leaching deep into the soil and losing it. Our hypothesis was that the tillage radish would release that nitrogen more quickly in the following spring, and the results confirmed that if we look, you can take a look at these nutrient profiles on your own. We can see that both the barley and the tillage radish took up the nitrogen fairly efficiently. And if we look at the wheat yield the next year, the highest wheat yield is where we had no catch crop, but we could have lost that nitrogen. The lowest yield is where we had the barley and the oilseed radish. The tillage radish is somewhere in between. So tillage radish works better than the barley, but it's still maybe holding on to a little bit of that nitrogen. But it is a practice worth considering if nitrogen leaching losses are a challenge. So we call that system a catch and release system, and give some thought to how you could manage that mineralization of nitrogen in where you live under your circumstances and put those ideas into the pot of soil. Okay, I want to make a few more points about the implications of what we're talking about for the global south versus the global north. This is a diagram which depicts how mineral fertilizer is currently being used around the world. This is the global south. They use relatively little nitrogen fertilizer. This is the global north. We use lots of nitrogen fertilizer. And Chloe McLaren and her colleagues at Rothamsted and at Swedish Agricultural University said, you know what? Why don't we think about doing this? It would help all of us, and it would reduce the greenhouse gases coming from nitrogen fertilizers. And so if we, let's go to the global north, first of all. That, by the way, that word south should be over here. I'm sorry. The global north, if we adopt the kind of legume systems that I've been talking about, we can certainly reduce our nitrogen fertilizer use by 30, maybe 50%. And we had a farmer taking this course from Saskatchewan, and he indicated that through intercropping and legume intensification, they've already reduced their nitrogen fertilizer use by 30%, and he felt they could go further. On the other hand, in the global south, even though adding legumes can enhance, and using conservation agriculture, as this picture shows, you can enhance food security relative to the business as usual farming system. And these are pictures of the areas that we're working in Eastern Africa. Fertilizer nitrogen is going to help them. So there they need a combination of manure and fertilizer. And so the conclusion that this McLaren group came up with is that we could balance out the nitrogen use around the world and actually have a net reduction in the nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer. And this is a really important topic because greenhouse gases are a challenge. And by 2050, Africa will be home to a quarter of the world's population. and food security needs to improve. Now, there's a lot of other nutrients. Remember in that cycle, I talked about potassium and sulfur and phosphorus. Um, and each of those cycles have their own unique challenges and their own unique opportunities. I wanted to just compare nitrogen with some of those other nutrients. And this table here shows the crop demand. So, for example, wheat at 14% protein requires 1.9 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, but it only requires zero point 0.5 of potassium, of a phosphorus, of P2O5, 0.35 of K2O, and zero point 0.1 of sulfur. So clearly, nitrogen is the nutrient that this crop uses in the highest amount. Um, and phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur are used in lower amounts. But what are the natural sources for those nutrients? We're going to talk about animals in a couple of modules, but I just want to warm you up to the idea that animal manures are very useful, and they're critical in certainly organic farming systems where we don't add any mineral fertilizers or we don't add mineral phosphorus at any rate. Managing those natural manure nutrients is also an art and a science. So if we look, for example, at dairy manure where straw is used for bedding of those dairy animals, and we look at P2O5, there's 4 units per ton in the manure. And then over on the right here, it estimates the available nutrients from the first growing season after the manure was added. And it's interesting that this phosphorus releases 3/4, according to these estimates, of its phosphorus in that first year. So when I started this lecture with the students in class, we talked about which cycles were fast and which cycles were slow. And some of us thought, well, the phosphorus cycle is really the slow one. But this shows us that phosphorus can make its manure can release its phosphorus fairly quickly. And so these are the subtle things that are important to know. There's other ways of managing the phosphorus cycle, and that is through the crop choice. This is a fascinating piece of work done in China by Long Li and colleagues, and they looked at the acidity or the pH around the root systems of faba bean, soybean, and maize or corn. And what we know is that the more acidic the rhizosphere, the area right around the root, the more able that plant is to extract phosphorus from the soil. And we can see faba bean is very good at extracting phosphorus, maize not so good. And so maybe growing these things together will actually help make phosphorus available. So many fascinating management steps to consider. Here we have another fascinating example of plants communicating when it comes to nutrient cycles. This is flax on the left. This is sorghum on the right. And in the middle, the scientists have intercropped flax with sorghum. And you can see that flax plant is much bigger than when flax is grown by itself. What's happening there? Well, the common mycorrhizal network is linking those two plants, and the carbon is moving from the sorghum into the flax because sorghum is a very carbon-rich plant. Sorghum is not unlike maize, and I think this kind of thing might just be happening with maize as well. And in this case, the sorghum is sharing carbon with the flax, allowing it to grow much larger. So a 46% larger flax plant, and it only costs the sorghum 7%. And so when we think about intercropping, we can manipulate the ability to take up soil phosphorus. We can also manipulate the ability of plants to share carbon. And so this is all of those interesting dynamics that happen at the soil plant interface. So I'm going to end there. That's my last slide. But I just wanted to, we'll come back to some of the slides that I skipped over, but I want you to think about ideas and questions you have about how soil phosphorus interacts with soil biology and with diverse cropping systems. All right. Well, thank you for paying such great attention to Module 3. I appreciated really very much your interest in sticking it out and going right to the end of the lecture. We'll see you in Module 4. Take care.